You know, it seems to me, Mr. Speaker, it's all about taxpayers, but it's never about citizens. And it's classic, the cost of everything and the value of nothing.
Like more and more Canadians, I, for years now, have become more and more aware of the urgency to act in terms of the environment. The need to develop policies and sustainable development is a must in order for us to face the many challenges of our times. Some may say that C-481 is not ambitious enough. Well, I feel rather that it represents a step in the right direction. My colleagues and my colleagues across the way should support it. And in fact, this is an amendment to a bill that the Conservatives themselves voted on unanimously in June of 2008. My bill is intended to ensure that laws and regulations presented by a federal minister in the future comply with the principles of the Federal Sustainable Development Act. The Minister of Justice would then report any inconsistency to the House at the earliest opportunity. The Department of Justice already has the obligation to review all bills and regulations that are tabled in the House to ensure that they are in compliance with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Bill C-481 merely ties this process to what has already been set out in the Federal Sustainable Development Act. The idea that human activity can cause significant and sustainable damage to our ecosystem is a must in politics and policy. My bill is intended to remind Canadians that to remind everyone that Canadians want sustainable development to be included in the decisions taken here in the House of Commons, including sustainable development. In the heart of all federal public policy is the best way to make Canada greener and more prosperous. But what is sustainable development, you might ask? Well, sustainable development is a principle according to which policies respond to present needs without compromising those of future generations. Sustainable development also relies on a long-term vision that can take into account the inextricable nature of the dimensions in terms of the environment, social, and economic activities and development. We are in the process of bequeathing to future generations the worst economic, social, and ecological debt in the history of our country. We cannot allow this situation to persist. Our trade partners see Canada as a guardian of significant world resources. Canada's success as a trading country depends on its ability to maintain its status as a global leader in order to meet the international expectations of us in terms of our protection of the environment. These expectations are more and more often embedded in international trade agreements. Several provinces have said for many years that it is very important for Canada to play a leading role in the implementation of sustainable development policies. Sustainable development is a principle according to which a policy responds to present needs without compromising those of future generations. I think that we have to apply this principle to all decisions made by the government and those taken here in this House. My bill will indeed give us a mechanism that will allow members or challenge members to act as a result of these sustainable development principles. C-481 is a step further in the right direction to put this principle at the very center of our decision-making process by encouraging people to draft bills that are consistent with the federal sustainable development strategy. C-481 will help them to take the right decisions in order to build a greener and more prosperous Canada. We want to show Canadians that we include sustainable development in the decision-making process. If C-481 is passed, those who draft bills that are not in compliance with sustainable development will have to pay the political price. I hope afterwards that the members of the House of Commons will make more effort to include sustainable development in their bills. We cannot leave environmental, social, and economic debts to future generations. We therefore must take care of the quality of life of our people and promote prevention rather than repression.
So, Mr. Speaker, Bill C-481 would amend the Federal Sustainability Development Act to require that the Minister of Justice examine bills and regulations to ensure they are not inconsistent with the purposes and provisions of the Act. The first main point I'd like to discuss is whether the amendments proposed in the bill are necessary. Mr. Speaker, they are not. As I've already pointed out, the bill is completely redundant in light of actions the government is already taking to achieve federal sustainable objectives, as well as transparency and accountability. The government already has tools in place for assessing and reporting the environmental effects of its actions, including two particularly significant ones: strategic environmental assessment and regulatory impact analysis. Mr. Speaker, strategic environmental assessments, which are required by a cabinet directive, identify and evaluate the potential environmental effects of government proposals. Strategic environmental assessments also involve considering whether further action could be taken to optimize the positive environmental effects of initiatives and minimize or mitigate any negative effects. Cabinet requires that a strategic environmental assessment be undertaken for all proposals intended for approval by a minister or by Cabinet, whenever its implementation could result in important environmental effects, either positive or negative. I should note that unlike the government's approach to strategic environmental assessment, Bill C-481 does not even include any assessment against any specific priorities or measurable objectives such as the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy, goals, and targets. This just further highlights how this bill is a wasteful use of taxpayers' money. The other major mechanism I want to mention is the Regulatory Impact Analysis Statement, or RIAS. A RIAS is created for proposed regulations, and its preparation is required by the Cabinet Directive on Regulatory Management. A RIAS summarizes the regulatory development process and the analysis conducted in support of a regulatory initiative. It describes the issues to be addressed, a cost-benefit analysis with distributional impacts of a proposed regulation, and the results of consultations. The results of a regulation's cost-benefit analysis summarized in the RIAS includes the cost or benefits to Canadians, the environment, businesses, as well as impacts on human health and safety. Like strategic environmental assessment, the RIAS process makes an important contribution to transparency, as RIASs are made available to the public in the Canada Gazette along with proposed regulations. Taken together, Mr. Speaker, these improvements, along with the previously mentioned tools in use by the government, provide Canadians with an unprecedented amount of information on the sustainable development decisions being made by the Government of Canada. This is all being done without a massive new bureaucracy that the NDP would like to create and the new spending and taxes that the NDP would like to implement through Bill C-481. As I've described, the government is already taking action to apply sustainable development in decision-making and ensure Canadians have information on the potential environmental effects of government initiatives. By taking these initiatives, the legislative and regulatory initiatives, our government is ensuring that environmental factors have been fully considered in decision-making processes. My second main point relates to the examination process proposed in Bill C-481. The examination process that the bill proposes is vague and redundant and is a wasteful use of taxpayers' money. I note that this examination process would go well beyond legal analysis and would constitute a significant departure from the current responsibilities of the Minister of Justice with regard to examining bills and regulations. For example, the Department of Justice currently does not have expertise in the area of sustainable development. Thus, this bill, Mr. Speaker, would require the government to waste taxpayers' money by creating and developing a new massive bureaucracy to duplicate measures I've already highlighted. Undoubtedly, they want to pay for all this by increasing taxes on hardworking Canadian families. In conclusion, given what the government's already doing, Bill C-481 would be a complete waste of taxpayers' money. The bill would add a layer of wasteful bureaucracy and oversight that is simply not needed. Here, I return to the most problematic part of Bill C-481. That is, of course, its true intention of creating massive new and wasteful bureaucracy. And this fact, I'm not afraid to say, Mr. Speaker, reflects the NDP's priorities completely.
It is indeed true that Canada has been blessed with incredible natural resources, and with those blessings do come responsibilities, Mr. Speaker. And so over the years, a number of measures have been introduced in this House to protect the environment, which is, and the attempt is always to balance the protection of the environment with the economic interests of the nation. When the Liberal Party was in government, we committed our government to the principles of sustainable development and passed legislation which required that each department submit with any legislative proposal its sustainable impact, its environmental impact on any legislation or any regulation. We also at that time actually insisted that ministers provide a gender analysis of each proposed piece of legislation. And one of the things I've noticed that this government has dropped has been a fiscal analysis with each proposed piece of legislation. This is particularly true in the justice section and all of these bills that keep coming out. There is actually no fiscal analysis that's attached other than bromides submitted by ministers from time to time about, oh, this won't cost us anything at all. The Liberal Party as well, Mr. Speaker, created the Office of the Minister of the Environment, which was attached to the Auditor General's Department, and comments on and does analysis of various environmental strategies that this government puts forward from time to time. We, along with the NDP, Mr. Speaker, are truly disappointed with this government and its continuing erosion of environmental policies. The Conservative government has systematically reduced the environmental review process and resource developments since taking office in 2006. 481 is, in my view, Mr. Speaker, a well-intentioned piece of legislation. It's not clear at this point what the costs will be. You can certainly see the benefits. I don't believe with my colleague, the Parliamentary Secretary for the Minister of Environment, that this in fact will create a massive bureaucracy or that it will cause all of the fear-mongering nonsense that he repeated towards the end of his speech. It's not going to create massive costs. And in fact, if the government was doing the job in the first place, probably the bill wouldn't be necessary. But when you have a profound mistrust by the Canadian population in the attitude and the actions of this government towards the environment, as a consequence, Mr. Speaker, you get bills like C-481, because at root, C-481 and the mover of 481 does not believe the Government of Canada is actually doing the job, does not believe that legislative and regulatory and economic initiatives are actually receiving a full environmental review. Now, I do have some questions with respect to in my judgment, overly broad application of the bill. It does say all bills that are presented to this House have to undergo a regulatory or a sustainability review, which at one level is a excuse me, a good idea. But you do have to ask yourself, well, suppose, for instance, the government put forward a bill which would be entitled the Prime Minister's Award for Ethics, Accountability, and Democratic Excellence. Now, Mr. Speaker, I know that might be a bit amusing to some in this House, But, you know, possibly it is possible that the Government of Canada would put forward such a bill on ethics and accountability and democratic excellence. Would C-481 apply to that bill? And, or to a bill, for instance, on a more serious subject like cyberbullying and various other things. So we do have some question, Mr. Speaker, with respect to the overly broad application of the legislation, but nevertheless, we take the view that this is a bill that's well motivated, that does address a deeply held view that this government has not addressed the environment in a sustainable fashion, that that the government's actions to date have had economic impact, have been negative on the environment, and are negatively impacting our international reputation abroad. So at this point, Mr. Speaker, we in the Liberal Party will be supporting this bill, urging all members that it be sent to committee. So thank you for your time.